want to do is to try and be, we want to feel we're good. We want to try and help the poor. We want to feed the sick. We want to try and help people who are aged be able to have good lives. That's we all want to do good. The next thing, next slide, David, is to try. Most of us realize we have to be doing well while doing that, and that usually happens. What we're trying to do is do good things for the world, but at the same time do good. Try and reduce the unemployment, try and get economic growth. Next slide, David. So, back one. Yeah, so as we've been hearing a lot this morning, San Francisco has done remarkably well, right? We've got these companies I've shown up here, you've seen them all, you know how that's been changed. So, forward, David? That one. Yeah, so we have Google, Park, Salesforce, all doing very well. That's well known. What I want to stress, next slide, David, is that we didn't do this the way most cities in the country do it, by just giving tax breaks to the big companies, to the Amazons and Toyotas, right? How do most of these companies all start here? Next slide. Is they all start in garages, right? The HP things, and almost always they start in little places. So this is very cost effective. Instead of giving tax breaks and giving millions away to attract a company, it costs almost nothing to help stimulate people getting going in a garage. So this is a way you can really boost your economy in a very inexpensive way, which for a Scotsman is actually what you want to do. Right? Next slide, David. So that's just those things which are in the IT space. We're talking a little bit here, given where we are. What about the biotech space? Well, that's also true. Over on the left there, that's my person who used to be in my department, Harold Blair. He got together with Swanson and came up with the idea of the biotechnology industry and created Genentech, right? Now Genentech, what's amazing though, it's down in South San Francisco, and that whole town is being transformed now into a biotech center. So little startup, little company moved into an area. It's now made South San Francisco a very affluent place to live. So this is a way of actually getting economic growth at a very low cost in areas such as South San Francisco. Now you might say, well, this is healthcare, and with all the big deals, right, the Googles and stuff are big. I would argue that health is going to be around a long time more than the metaverse and social media, right? And currently, 20% of the United States budget is spent on healthcare, right? So a major part of our economy, and so it's a reasonable thing to address. Next slide. Yeah, now it's actually very important though, there's a big need for people to be getting into this area. This, for some of you may have seen, is a very well-known statistic in my field. It's called the E-room law. And what it says is that the number of drugs you get per $1 billion is been dropping with a half-life of 9 years, right? It's a negative exponential here. And of course, there's no such person, E-room, that's just the opposite of Moore, right? Because the Moore's law is there showing that, in the IT industry, everything's going up exponentially. In my industry, things are getting harder and harder. So there's real need for innovation in the life sciences industry. Next slide. Yeah, so what do you do to, so startups are the key, putting people in garages and getting them off the ground, that's key. How do we do it? Well, this is the standard model. You start up a company and it survives on venture and angel funding, and that creates a successful company. Now, one of the things that's good to ask is, if you look where in the world do you see centers of science and technology innovation? I would say there's mainly 3. Next slide. Those are San Francisco, of course, Boston, and London, right? Those are my areas. I'm not doing things like movies. That's not high-end. Hollywood, of course, doesn't. So anyway, what's unusual about those 3? Well, it's probably the explanation that at the center is the next slide, right? Each one of those is centers of major universities, right? And so, but it turns out that those universities are not enough. Next slide. You've got to use these universities to anchor an ecosystem. The universities, great ideas are coming out, but you better have venture capital around. You better have business advisors around to help. And in our case, in the area, we had the help of the local government. As Fiona said, the state government put a couple $100 million into QB3, and we've been trying to help the economy of California for the last 20 years or so. And actually, as we've also heard, Massachusetts is putting money into the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center. Now, we've got about $200 million over 20 years. Massachusetts is putting in $1.5 billion into this area. So Massachusetts, I have to say, is ahead of us in almost every metric in the life sciences space. So next slide. And so one of the things is, so you have a great ecosystem, but even in ecosystem, companies fail, right? Things go wrong. And so what we have to try and do is think, how can we actually try and enhance the possibilities these companies are successful? Next slide. So one of the things I want to stress here, there's a tendency, and I still use it, to call these places where you have startups, call them incubators, right? Now, incubators, you mainly think of as places you put eggs, right? You keep them at 37 degrees, and a chicken comes out. I would argue that's a bad model, because everything the egg needs to develop is in the egg, right? All you have to do is keep the temperature at 37 degrees, and everything takes care of it. Startup companies are not like that. The next slide, a better model is next slide, is you think of it as being like a nursery, right? Where you've got talented young people there, but they really need a lot of assistance with people with experience. So the whole idea of talking about an incubator is perhaps a bad metaphor for what we do. Next slide. So what do we do here to try and reduce the probability of failure, enhance the probability of success? How do we actually prevent a nursery for our startups? There's 4 areas. I want to just briefly say them. One of them is that because we're on a campus here, all of our startups have access to the incredibly sophisticated equipment that's present here on this campus, and actually at UCSF as well, the medical school in the city. Next slide. Just shows some of that equipment we use. And it's not just equipment, we have clinical trial centers in all these places. So no commercial startup incubator place ever has anything like the resources you have on the university. The nice thing is, all of this equipment is paid for by the federal government, NIH funding. So we're using federal funding to try and grow the local economy, right? Which is a nice way to go. Next slide. So yeah, the other thing is mentorship. Now, there's 2 classes of mentorship here. One of them is what you will call generic or general mentorship, right? You know, how do venture funds work? How do you set up a board, right? How do you get IP? You know, how do you build a team? And you can get that sort of general stuff, which is generic. It covers all startups. Almost every university teaches courses in that. There's courses online on that stuff. When I was working for Janet Napolitano, the Office of the President here, President of California, we found there was 88 different programs teaching entrepreneurship on the 10 campuses of the University of California. There's no shortage of people being taught the general principles of innovation. So we don't want to do that. But we're more interested in how can you give specific advice, specific mentorship that's targeted to the particular needs of the company. So somebody comes in, someone comes into us and wants to start a company. Well, if it's an IT company, you're doing the computer sciences, your whole world is almost completely different than if you're in the life sciences. You know, it's a very different way of approaching companies. So you don't want to get advice from someone who is an IT expert to start your company. But even now, if you say you want to do life sciences, what sort of life sciences? Is it going to be ag tech? Is it going to be synthetic biology? Is it going to be medical, biotech? Suppose it's going to be biotech. What sort of biotech is? Is it going to be diagnostic devices, drug therapies, or biological therapies? Suppose you even say biological therapies. You're going to do DNA, protein, you're going to do genetic engineering. For each one of those characteristics, there's people who are expert, and you have to be able to talk to experts in those fields. So just give me, take an example in the next slide, David, of someone comes in and says, and I'm doing this because David is in genetic engineering, so he's appropriate. Suppose someone comes in and I want to start a company around genetic engineering, right, DNA change. So you say, well, first thing, what's novel? I say, well, I've got this great way of engineering DNA. Okay, good, pass that one. What's your market? I'm going to work on back pain. Back pain is a huge problem in the country. Oh yeah, that's good. That's a good thing. You've got a nice thing with a major market. Right. Then you say, well, is there any competition in the field? Other people out there doing this sort of thing? In particular, how many other companies have tried to do what you've done and have failed, right? So, because you want to tell me why your company is going to be better. And so you say, oh, well, I've got this quality control mechanism the other companies don't have, so I'm not going to be one of the ones that fail. Good, you pass on that one, right? Then you say, what efficacy? How do you know your treatment of genetic engineering is going to work on pain? Well, usually you go to an animal model. So he says, well, I've got this mouse, it's got pain, and I give it my genetic engineering thing, and it looks like the mouse isn't in pain anymore, it's not covering up its head. I say, well, that's not so good, and mice are not usually good models for humans, but let's pass on that one. All right, we're going to now get in a clinical trial. You're going to do your genetic engineering with people with back pain. How are you going to measure whether your thing is working or not? He says, oh, that's okay. I've got this pain scale. I'm going to ask my patients, well, on a level of 10, when very severe pain down to 1, where are you? And I'm going to see if they move down the pain scale as I go through my therapy. Now you get really worried, right? Because what one knows is the placebo effect. Every time you give somebody any drug, they think they get better, right? It's the most well-established thing in medicine, right? Big effect. So it has been very clear when you use pain measures as a measure of efficacy, the placebo effect clicks in, you always get a benefit even if you put saline into the people, right? That's been shown many, many times. So the next slide, actually this is so well known, there's even a cartoon about it, right? The guy says, the trial shows our new drug performs no better than the placebo, so the suggestion is maybe we should invest in placebos. Right? So anyway, this is the sort of detailed way you have to give mentorship to a company if you really want to give specific mentorship and not just this generic thing about how to set up a board and how to work with venture capital. Next slide. So this is what I hope David would talk about now. What about sources of venture capital? Everybody's short on money. Where'd you get it? Well, standard venture, angel, we have a mechanism for doing it. The thing that David is setting up, which is quite remarkable, is our own venture fund. We will have our own 50 million venture fund to invest in our companies in our incubator, right? So we've got that. And then that's a really nice thing for us to have. And of course, the return on that venture fund comes back into us, so it becomes an evergreen fund. And this is what David is working on, and we talked about it. I want to just push a little bit about something I've been working on personally, I find quite exciting. It's a new thing, right? And that is what we're calling, venture philanthropy or impact philanthropy, right? Now, how does that work? And I want to do that by an example. Next slide. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, small foundation working on a fairly minor disease, right? It used to put its limited research funds into university labs to try and get breakthroughs in cystic fibrosis. Then he said, just like we were saying, well, the limiting point of getting things to the market is often to get a startup going, right? So why don't we, instead of just putting all of our money into university labs, why don't we put some into startups? And first he did it non-dilutively, taking no credit, but then he said, well, why don't we just take some equity for the company, right? So they took equity in the company, and that company came up and developed the drug, Kali-Deco, which is actually now the therapy that's used for cystic fibrosis worldwide. The next slide shows the amazing result. That if you look now, when Cystic Fibrosis Foundation sold its equity in this company, it got $3.3 billion back. Right? So it's now a small foundation with a huge amount of money. You can see the red is how much it spends, the purple is how much money it's got. It's rolling in money, right? So I know this, we've got a partnership with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, so we work closely with them. The key point here is almost every major foundation and family foundation is clicking and saying, wait a minute, instead of having bake sales and running marathons to raise money for our things, why don't we actually invest wisely in early startups? So there's a big evolution now of money coming into it, not just from money-making venture capitalists, but people who are actually philanthropists, impact philanthropy. This is an area which is growing very, very rapidly in the Bay Area right now. And that's what I want to mention. I think it's probably, there's so much money in the Bay Area right now and people want to do something with the money. We're seeing more and more of it going into this impact philanthropy. Next slide. So this is what I just want to end. So this is, what about this workspace? Well, you're going to go around here and Gino will tell you a whole lot more about it today. But I want to end a little bit on this about what my dream is, about where I would like to see this go. I would like this building you're going to spend some time in today being an international model of how universities should evolve. All research universities will be thinking in this way. And my thinking is based on the fact I spent most of my life in academic health centers. Academic health centers, when you think about them, are very unusual places. You know, they're academic, you've got professors wearing gowns, giving out degrees, graduation, all the rest of it. But at the same place, you have a hospital. The hospital's a business, right? It's got to compete with other hospitals. So we hear this unusual marriage of an academic entity with something that's doing good for society, in this case, improving health, right? And the benefits of this are clear. You know, the university provides good ideas for new therapies, the hospital. In particular, the medical students get exposed to real patients, right? We don't teach medical students by giving them case studies. You put them in the ward and you give them practical experience of being a doctor. So what I'd like to do is adapt that here and maybe make this one of the world's first academic innovation centers. Next slide. Right, so the idea is take away the hospital and replace it with an incubator like this. And you get basically the same advantages, right? All maybe even better, all the creativity from the university can flow into ideas that become practical there. You can get clinical insights from which we get from our hospital here. And we get student interns coming to work in the companies, which the companies love. Conversely, and this is why Berkeley is so excited by doing this, right? Berkeley hopes to be unique in being a university where its students coming in and taking innovation and entrepreneurship classes can actually come over here and work and mix with and actually be part of working with innovation and entrepreneurship. So the key thing is universities, and I hope this will happen widely, are beginning to recognize that what the students want is to be taught innovation and entrepreneurship. They don't want to be Jack Welch's anymore, right? They all want to be Steve Jobs. That's what the students are demanding in this. And this is something universities can fulfill their public service. They're giving back to society by stimulating entrepreneurship, because this is entrepreneurship for public good. So that's what I want to say. My last slide is just to say follow-ups from this visit, what might come out of your visit here. One of the things, it could be for a foreign country. You could actually a big company in one of your countries could actually acquire one of our startups. This is a really nice way to get a satellite in a foreign country, right? So you've got a small group of people who already live here within the ecosystem. So it's a very simple way of bridging your country with us. And by the way, we accept companies from anywhere in the world, right? Harvard has one of these things that's only for Harvard alums, right? That's not true of us, right? We take talented people from anywhere. So we want people to come from a country that could be here. Another thing is we need a lot of people outsource now in virtual things, outsource things. So like Wuxi in China has been terrific as source for outsourcing things for drug development. So would it be nice to have a company providing outsourced services to the people in our incubator? And also, I think we're all trying to do good, do well while doing good. To the extent we can share best practices and talk with each other. This is not a zero-sum game, right? We're very open about what we're doing, and I think we're all open about the good ideas we have, then the whole world will run faster. And of course, what I'd like to do, talking with you later on today, if you have any other ideas, follow up with those, talk to me or David about those. So should I get David to say a few words? Sorry for being such a nonsense. I'm letting you enjoy your honeymoon.
Thanks so much, Rich. Is my back on the screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I believe that Darlene was going to prompt a Q&A session, or student folks from Nottingham had questions. I'd be happy to chime in on the components that we're trying to assemble and build here at PPH more in detail, since I feel those, it's a combination of those components which are really going to be critical for being able to, maximize the chances that our companies grow, succeed, move on, and graduate from our smart days, and again to have a positive impact in California and the U.S. economy as a whole. At the same time, creating products that are going to address major societal needs, such as statistic fibrosis potentially. So perhaps, Darlene, are there questions that we could be prompted to discuss?
Yeah, so one thing is, I know we say that you have big shoes to fill, but the thing is that with your experience, right, you've already had 9, 10 startups that you... Eight startups that you have successfully exited. Why don't you talk about that and, started. So let's talk about, funding, the venture world, how that has helped in your mind, and what you would like to do that you're going to be taking the research to.
Sure. One of the things that Reg, of course, mentioned is that the Bay Area is really unique in a number of ways. Not only do we have incredible academic resources, ideas, very well-trained people who have the potential to join companies or start companies, but we also have a economy that's willing to take risks. So that includes the support from the state. Fiona Ma talked about SIR a little bit earlier. I also had the pleasure of directing the Berkeley Stem Cell Center for 10 years and really benefited in the state's investment in stem cell research and biotech research. But in addition, there's of course more private sources of funding. So the overall, this is PitchBook numbers from last year, 2021, the most recent numbers. So VC companies, this is in all sectors, biotech as well as tech. It's not broken down, but VC companies, VC-backed companies raised around $330 billion in 2021. And interestingly, over a third of that was in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. So, $120 billion of VC funds were invested in companies in the Bay Area, over 3,400 deals, individual deals, investments within companies. So there is a tolerance for risk, for investments in early stage companies within the Bay Area, and that's significantly benefited us. The overall investments in biotech is smaller than that. It's around $40 billion across the entire country, and a significant fraction of that are going to the Bay Area as well. So this is something that's an absolutely critical, necessary component, obviously, for companies to be able to succeed and grow. To have people who are willing to recognize and appreciate their vision and to take risk to invest in them. And as we mentioned earlier during the introductory comments, we're trying to create our own smaller version of that on the Berkeley campus and within QB3, where we've successfully raised donor money. A donor came forward and is enabling us to put together a philanthropic VC fund where funds would be invested in Baker Labs companies, and proceeds out of that would be distributed both to our programs to benefit them, as well as cycle back into the fund, enable the next investments into everybody in this fund, looking ahead hopefully indefinitely. So this is something that we, obviously there's huge investment in the Bay Area as a whole. This is something we'd like to replicate as well within Baker Labs. Since of course there have been changes in the economy and the biotech economy over the past 6 months, and we want to ensure that our companies continue to have that access to the strong levels of capital they need to succeed and to grow.
Thanks, David. I do want to know, and I'm sure a lot of people want to know here as well, what are some of the challenges? I mean, we've been talking about funding, and I think to anybody in the audience, they're going to think, oh my God, there's a lot of money in the Bay Area, and I can definitely tap into it. But there's got to be some challenges, and could you share what some of the challenges might be?
Sure. So on the plus side, we roughly started running around 2012. Well, going back to 2008 with the world economic crash. Capital was standing on the sidelines of biotech for several years. And around 2012, the capital markets began to recover, and we're looking for places to put money to work. And biotech was emerging as something that had not been invested in for a long period of time. There have been significant advances in biotech, and three areas really drove the explosion in biotech, private and public investment over the past decade. So it's been cancer immunotherapy, which incidentally was founded on the Berkeley campus with Jim Allison's work. He won the Nobel Prize for that in 2018. In addition, there's gene therapy and genome editing. So those three areas were really responsible for a lot of growth over the past 10 years in biotech. So there has been a massive increase in private investments, VC investments, angel investments, in corporate investments. So pharma has been responsible for a large amount of merger and acquisition activity acquired by small biotechs. And of course, public markets have been a source of financing. That has changed, over the past half year, and especially since August. So the Nasdaq Biotech Index has fallen since August 11th, which was its peak, and the IPO market is really come close to shutting down. It's these types of boom and recess cycles dominate economics across all fields. And that's something that we're experiencing in biotech right now as well. So the good news is that there's still momentum. A lot of money was raised by VC funds, and they have to put their money to work. They have to deploy it and make investments. So that does mean that there is going to be a lot of runway that's going to be open for small companies in this area still. But at the same time, the public markets have kind of propagated backwards through the private markets. Valuations are coming down. It's getting difficult to raise money, and so that in some sense makes it that much more important we invest our efforts in being able to develop programs, develop new sources of financing that can help our companies succeed.
Thanks, David. And before I ask my last question, I just wanted to know if there are any questions from the audience. Yes.
This is just a quick question, but I was wondering, and we might cover this later, about the capacity of the space. How many companies are we talking about here, and any specific kind of sectors within biotech that are a priority?
Thank you. Did you hear that, David? Yeah. The priorities, what's the
Sure.
capacity and the priority sectors? Yeah.
So it's 40,000 square feet of lab space, which you're going to tour. It's beautiful space, cutting edge space. And we think that this is based upon numbers from previous incubators that Reg started up, where we have ballpark idea on average square footage per company that will be needed. So we think we're going to have that somewhere on the order of 45, 50 companies or so at steady state. We have onboarded this as of last week, 25 companies. So we're getting close to 50 to 60% occupancy since we opened up our doors for business last Thanksgiving. But this is due to the incredible work of Reg and Gina, as well as others. And if you take a look at the sectors in which those companies are working, the majority of them are in therapeutics. So 60, 70% of them or so are in therapeutics. Within therapeutics, there's a pretty significant concentration of gene and cell therapy, which is a reflection, like I mentioned, gene therapy and genome editing were two of the major drivers in the growth of the biotech field over the past 10 years, and that's reflected within the bigger labs. But also there are companies in other areas, tools companies that are working on technologies such as protein sequencing, as well as food tech and ag tech companies who are trying to develop more efficient crops, crops that can better utilize energy and be more resilient in the face of climate change. as well as novel ways to generate foods in a synthetic way that doesn't involve the use of animals. So I think we have a pretty healthy spectrum and portfolio of companies. There's been pretty significant demand to be able to enter into the space, and we're pretty happy with how our critical masses have been growing.
Thank you, David. Yes.
Hi, David. I'm from the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is, what's the difference between Baker Labs and the other incubators also focused on biomedicine and life sciences? What's the special advantage of Baker Labs? And my second question is that can all these startups, including Chinese startups, I mean, if they will be also coming to Baker Lab, have free accesses to the research facilities of UC Berkeley and UCSF? Thank you. Oh, and also,
Yeah, I'll answer the second one, maybe kick the first person to Reg, because it really, his vision is responsible for what differentiates Baker Labs from other incubators in the country. One of the things that, and Reg mentioned this, is that, especially right now, since the cost of capital is going up, it's really important for companies to be able to get access to cutting-edge equipment. So there are, on the order of 24 facilities on UC Berkeley campus right across the street, everything from next generation sequencing to confocal microscopy to cell sorting to mass spec, etc. And they're quite literally, tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment within these facilities. And that obviously is something that's very difficult for a small company that's trying to be cash lean to replicate. So we wanted to have access to these core facilities, for our companies. And you run into a snag, which is the fact that by University of California policy, and this is a statewide policy, data or intellectual property that's generated in university square footage and using university resources, that IP is assigned to the regions of the University of California. So that's obviously a non-starter. Why would a company pay to use a core facility when universities can own the IP? So last year, a number of people on our campus, and this includes people within the intellectual property office, within the innovation and entrepreneurship office, as well as myself, worked through the system and all the way up to UC office president. There's a research policy office that really got it, understood the problem, and carved out a university-wide exception to this rule, such that if companies go across the street and pay in a very simple fee-for-service relationship, that they're buying routine services on the campus that are the services themselves are not innovative, even though data, the result of that may be. But if it's a simple fee-for-service, the IP goes to the company rather than to the university. And that umbrella extended to Baker Labs as well. Companies are paying fees, rent, in exchange for services, access to square footage and to the great resources of this building. And as a result, companies own the IP for entering into that fee-for-service relationship. So this is something that we feel is, effectively going to increase the capital that the company have, because their dollars will go further as a result of the fact they can get that access to this high-power equipment at rates that are actually very reasonable. Reg, you want to talk about what really differentiates Baker Labs from our incubators?
So again, it's a very important question, because just like any company, we have to say what's a competitive space, right? And there's plenty of other life sciences incubators around. They tend to be in two other categories. One, they're just for-profit types, like Alexandria. Now, they, of course, have to make profit for their investors, so they charge a lot. They charge about twice as much as we do. There's other ones which are strategic ones, like J&J and Agilent and Bayer, that try and have startups because that's the way they think they can be. They're closing down their own research labs, and this is a way of them to get a view of things that are out there. What's different with us, I think, is two things. One, we're seeing this as an educational function. We're trying to get our students access to this whole area. But also, and this is deep to my heart, is to think that we're trying to think that You go into entrepreneurship, you go and start a company not to go and drive in a limo and be rich. You do that because this is the way of solving problems in society. And so it's just as important for our young students thinking, well, I'm going to go be a professor somewhere. They'll think, oh, I can do just as well for the world by going and starting a company. So we're trying to force the idea of altruism as being a driving force in entrepreneurship and away from market-driven economy. You only get that in universities.
Social impact is very key now, especially in everything. When you look at biotech, when you look at innovation in general, in Bay Area and California, it's all about social impact, right? So I think we're running out of time, but thank you so much for giving us an overview and an introduction and the history of biotech and how it started in San Francisco and now Bay Area. Thank you so much for dialing in. I know you're spending your honeymoon over in Istanbul and in Turkey, so have a good time and have a great evening. I think it's dinner time over there, right? Thank you so much, David.